I didn't start it, but I definitely finished it moment. I was 22, fresh out of college, working as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. My supervisor, Brendan, was one of those guys who peaked in high school and never got over it. 38 years old, still talking about his football glory days, still treating women like we existed solely for his entertainment and convenience. It started small, the way these things always do. Comments about my outfits, how I should smile more because I looked too serious for such a pretty girl. Jokes about finding me a boyfriend who could handle me and teach me how to have fun. I ignored it initially, thinking it would stop if I just kept my head down and did good work. My cubicle was positioned right outside his glass office, so escape wasn't an option. "Morning, Delilah," he'd say every day, leaning over my desk so his coffee breath hit my face. "That's a tight little dress." Trying to impress someone special today? I'd force a smile and turn back to my computer, but he'd linger, making comments about my legs or asking if I was wearing that new perfume just for him. His voice carried that tone men use when they think they're being charming but actually sound predatory. "You know, you'd be even prettier if you smiled more," he'd say, then laugh like it was the most original observation ever made. The other women in the office would shoot me sympathetic looks but never said anything directly. I understood why later. The whispered conversations in the bathroom told the real story. 3 women had already been forced out after filing complaints against Brendan. Their careers were systematically destroyed, their references poisoned, their reputations smeared across the industry. "Just keep your head down and don't give him any ammunition," whispered Patricia from payroll during one of our brief kitchen encounters. "He gets bored eventually if you don't react." Jennifer tried to fight back last year and now she can't get hired anywhere in the city. But Brendan wasn't getting bored with me. If anything, my lack of response seemed to encourage him. He interpreted my professional politeness as playing hard to get. Then came the touching. It started with a hand on my shoulder that lingered too long during meetings. Accidental bumps in the hallway where his hand would graze my chest or hip. When I wore dresses, he'd find excuses to walk by my desk and look down my neckline, sometimes even bending over to point at something on my computer screen. "Let me show you how to fix that spreadsheet error," he'd say, pressing his body against my back as he reached over to use my mouse. His breath would be hot on my neck, his hand sometimes, accidentally, brushing my breast as he moved. I started documenting everything in a secret folder on my personal laptop. Times, dates, witnesses present, exact quotes when I could remember them, but I felt completely powerless. Brendan was best friends with Thomas, the HR director. They played golf together every weekend at the country club. He was also tight with 2 of the senior partners, having gone to college with one and serving as best man at the other's wedding. The company culture made it clear that Brendan was untouchable. He brought in the biggest clients, had connections throughout the industry, and was being groomed for a partnership track. Meanwhile, I was a recent graduate with student loans and no family connections. Who would believe me? Who would even care? "Don't take it personally," advised Melissa from the front desk. "That's just how Brendan is. He doesn't mean anything by it." But I could see in her eyes that she knew better. She was just protecting herself by staying invisible. Things escalated gradually over my first 6 months. Brendan started calling me into his office for private consultations about my work. These sessions would last an hour or more, during which he'd sit on the edge of his desk instead of behind it, positioning himself so I had to look up at him. He'd compliment my appearance more than my actual work performance. "You're really blossoming here, Delilah," he'd say, his eyes scanning my body. "I can see you have a lot of potential. With the right guidance and mentorship, you could go far in this company." The implication was always clear. The right mentorship meant his mentorship. Going far meant going along with whatever he wanted. He started inviting me to lunch, just the 2 of us. When I made excuses, he'd frame it as a work requirement. "Part of your professional development," he'd explain. "You need to learn how business is really conducted. That happens over meals, not in conference rooms." During these lunches, he'd order wine and pressure me to drink. "Come on, live a little. You're always so buttoned up." When I'd stick to water, he'd joke about how I was no fun and needed to loosen up if I wanted to succeed in business. He'd tell me about his college days, his brief semi-professional football career, his connections in the industry, always with the underlying message that my success depended on staying in his good graces. "I like you, Delilah," he'd say, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "You remind me of myself when I was starting out, hungry, willing to do what it takes to get ahead." The breaking point came during our annual company retreat at the Riverside Resort, a sprawling complex 2 hours outside the city. The entire firm spent 3 days there for team building and strategic planning, though mostly it was an excuse for the partners to play golf and everyone else to drink by the pool. I'd managed to avoid Brendan for most of the retreat by staying close to groups of other employees. But on the final evening after the company dinner and award ceremony, I found myself alone at the hotel bar. Most people had either gone to bed or were continuing the party in someone's suite. I was catching up on emails before the next morning's early checkout. That's when Brendan appeared, sliding into the booth beside me before I could escape. He positioned himself to block my exit, trapping me against the wall. I could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the glassy look in his eyes that meant he'd been drinking steadily since the dinner ended. Well, he said, his voice thick with alcohol. "Look who's hiding out here all by herself, working even on vacation. That's dedication." "Just finishing up some client emails," I said, closing my laptop. "I should probably head to bed soon. Early flight tomorrow." "Hold on there, speed racer," he said, his hand landing on my arm to prevent me from standing. "The night's still young. We should talk." "About what?" I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. "About your future here," he said, his hand moving to my thigh. You know, Delilah, you could advance a lot faster in this company if you were more cooperative, more of a team player. His fingers squeezed my leg, and I felt sick to my stomach. I think I am a team player, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My performance reviews have been good. He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Performance reviews? That's cute. You think this business is about spreadsheets and client reports? It's about relationships, sweetheart. Personal relationships. His hand moved higher on my thigh, and I tried to slide away. The booth was too narrow, and he was pressed against my side, using his body weight to keep me trapped. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, my heart starting to race. No misunderstanding, he said, his face closer to mine now. I've been patient with you for 6 months, giving you time to settle in, get comfortable, but I'm done waiting. You're going to come up to my room tonight, or your career here is over. Simple as that. His breath was hot against my cheek, and I could feel panic rising in my throat. This was really happening. After months of escalation, he was finally making his move. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. His phone was sitting on the table, screen facing up. A voice memo app was open, the red recording light blinking steadily. He was recording our conversation. What's that for? I asked, nodding toward the phone. He followed my gaze and grinned, showing teeth stained by red wine and whiskey. Insurance policy, sweetheart. In case you get any bright ideas about reporting this conversation later, your word against mine, except I'll have proof that you were flirting, asking for it, leading me on. He leaned closer, his lips almost touching my ear. You think anyone's going to believe that sweet little Delilah was just an innocent victim? When I play them this recording of you agreeing to come to my room? But Brendan had made one crucial mistake in his drunken confidence. He was too intoxicated to notice that I'd already switched our phones earlier in the evening. When he'd gone to the bathroom during dinner, I'd seen him leave his phone on the table. On impulse, I'd swapped it with mine. Our phones were identical models with the same black protective cases. The phone currently recording on the table was mine, which I'd immediately set to airplane mode. His actual phone, the one with all his contacts, photos, and files, was sitting in my purse. You know what? I said, forcing my voice to sound thoughtful rather than terrified. Maybe you're right. Maybe I have been too focused on just the work side of things. His grip on my thigh loosened slightly as he smiled with satisfaction. Now you're talking sense. I knew you were smarter than you let on. For the next 25 minutes, I let him talk, and talk, and talk. The alcohol had loosened his tongue completely, and his arrogance made him careless. He detailed exactly how the system worked at our firm, and apparently several others in the city, which managers were involved in the network, how they selected targets, what happened to women who refused their advances or tried to file complaints. It's not just about sex, he explained, his hand still on my leg, but his focus now on bragging about his power. It's about control, about knowing your place in the hierarchy. These young girls come in thinking they're going to change the world with their degrees and their ambition. Someone has to teach them how things really work. He named names, described specific incidents with other women, including some who'd left the company under mysterious circumstances. He bragged about having compromising photos of a junior associate named Rebecca, who'd been convinced to quit after refusing his advances. Thomas in HR is key to the whole operation, he continued, apparently forgetting that he was supposedly recording this as evidence against me. He buries any complaints that come in, makes the paperwork disappear, helps us build cases against troublemakers by documenting their performance issues and attitude problems. He described a network that extended beyond our firm, involving managers at competing companies who shared information about women who'd filed harassment complaints, effectively blacklisting them from the entire industry. The beauty of it is, they do most of the work themselves, he said with a laugh. They get so frustrated and demoralized that they just quit. Problem solved. No messy legal battles. The most damaging part came when he started talking about specific partners in the firm who were aware of his behavior and either participated or looked the other way because of his client relationships. Harrison Webb knows exactly what's going on, he said, referring to the managing partner. But I bring in $8 million a year in billings. What's he gonna do? Fire his golden goose because some secretary feels uncomfortable? By the time he finally passed out in the booth, his head lolling back against the leather seat, I had 25 minutes of the most incriminating audio I could have imagined. But that was just the beginning. Back in my hotel room, I connected his phone to my laptop and discovered something that made my hands shake. Brendan had been recording voice memos for months, not just with me, but with other women. He thought he was creating insurance against false accusations, but what he'd actually done was document his own crimes in exhaustive detail. The phone contained 47 different audio files. Some were recordings of conversations with women he was harassing. Others were him talking to himself, planning his approaches, celebrating his successes, complaining about women who'd gotten away. In one particularly vile recording, he described in graphic detail what he'd done to Rebecca, the junior associate who'd quit. In another, he talked about photos he'd taken of women without their consent during company events. There were recordings of phone calls with other managers, coordinating their efforts to push out problem employees. But the most shocking discovery was a folder of photos and videos. Pictures taken up women's skirts during meetings. Photos from the company Christmas party where he'd drugged women's drinks and photographed them in compromising positions. Videos recorded through the office windows of women changing clothes, thinking they had privacy. I spent the entire night downloading everything to multiple external drives and cloud storage accounts. By dawn, I had copies of nearly 6 months of evidence documenting a systematic pattern of sexual harassment, assault, drugging, and illegal surveillance involving at least 15 women and half a dozen male managers across 4 different companies. Monday morning, I walked into the office with a plan, but I didn't go to HR first. I didn't go to the partners. I went straight to the local news station. WZTN Channel 7 had an investigative unit led by reporter Roxanne Torres, who'd won awards for exposing corruption in local government and business. When I called and said I had evidence of a sexual harassment network involving multiple companies, she agreed to meet me immediately. "This is bigger than just workplace harassment," she said after reviewing just the first few recordings. "This is organized criminal activity. Drugging people, taking photos without consent, conspiracy to destroy careers. We're talking about felony charges." While she began preparing her investigation, I made copies of everything and started distributing them strategically. One package went to the State Labor Board, another to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a third to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. Then I did something that still makes me smile. I created an anonymous email account and sent selected recordings to every employee in our company, plus employees at the 3 other firms mentioned in Brendan's conversations. All 347 people received an email with the subject line, "The truth about sexual harassment at your workplace." I included a note. The attached recordings were made by the harassers themselves. They thought they were creating evidence to use against their victims. Instead, they documented their own crimes. If you've been a victim, you're not alone, and you now have proof. Tuesday morning, I walked into work to absolute chaos. The parking lot was full of news vans. Police cars were parked near the entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see people in suits who definitely weren't employees walking around with badges and briefcases. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with panic and fury. Brendan was screaming at Thomas from HR, demanding they trace the email and find out who'd leaked the recordings. 3 women from accounting were huddled in the main conference room with lawyers. The phones were ringing constantly with reporters, clients, and regulatory agencies demanding statements. "This is corporate espionage," Brendan was shouting. "Someone stole confidential files and distributed them illegally. I want arrests made." That's when FBI agent Sarah Mitchell approached him. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, the files we're interested in are the ones you created yourself." I watched from my cubicle as 2 federal agents escorted Brendan to a private office for questioning. His face had gone from red with anger to gray with fear in about 10 seconds. "Delilah?" Thomas from HR appeared at my desk, his usual smug confidence replaced by obvious panic. "We need to talk. Now." In his office, he tried to play good cop. "Look, I know Brendan can be intense sometimes, but we handle these things internally. Going to the media was unnecessary and damaging to everyone's careers, including yours." "What things?" I asked innocently. "I'm not sure what you mean." His eye twitched. "Don't play games with me. I know you're behind this somehow. The timing is too convenient." "Behind what?" I continued. "I came to work like any other day and found the office full of FBI agents. Maybe you should ask Brendan what he did to deserve federal attention." Before Thomas could respond, Agent Mitchell knocked on the door. "Mr. Thomas, we need to speak with you about your role in suppressing harassment complaints and destroying personnel files." I excused myself and returned to my desk, where I pretended to work while watching the drama unfold around me. By lunchtime, 4 more employees had been taken for questioning, including 2 senior managers whose names had appeared in Brendan's recordings. The news story broke that evening during the 6 o'clock broadcast. Roxanne Torres had worked around the clock to verify the recordings and gather additional testimony. Her investigation revealed a network of sexual harassment spanning 6 companies in the metropolitan area, involving over 30 women and at least 12 male managers. These recordings, made by the perpetrators themselves, document a systematic campaign of sexual harassment, assault, and career sabotage, Torres reported. Federal investigators say this may be the largest workplace harassment conspiracy ever uncovered in this region. The story included interviews with 5 women who'd been targeted by the network. Their faces were obscured, but their stories were devastating. One woman described being drugged at a company party and waking up with photos of herself being circulated among male managers. Another told of being forced out of her job after refusing sexual advances, only to find that she'd been blacklisted from other companies in the industry. By Thursday, the story had gone national. CNN picked it up, then the major networks. The hashtag recorded evidence started trending on social media as women across the country shared their own stories of workplace harassment. Our firm's stock price dropped 60% in 3 days. Major clients began canceling contracts. The state attorney general announced a formal investigation into the entire industry's hiring and promotion practices. Friday morning, I was called into the managing partner's office. I expected to be fired, sued, or worse. Instead, I found Harrison Webb looking like he'd aged 10 years in 1 week. "Miss Delilah," he said, standing when I entered. "I owe you an apology. A profound, personal apology." He gestured for me to sit, then surprised me by taking the chair next to mine rather than staying behind his imposing desk. "I've spent the last 3 days listening to those recordings," he said, his voice heavy. "Hearing my company described as a hunting ground, hearing about crimes committed in our offices with our equipment during company time. I'm ashamed that this happened under my leadership." He explained that the firm's board of directors had met in emergency session and voted unanimously to implement sweeping changes. Brendan and Thomas were fired immediately, along with 4 other managers. An independent firm would handle all harassment complaints going forward. Sensitivity training would be mandatory for all employees, starting with senior management. "We're also promoting you to senior accountant, effective immediately," Webb said, "along with a 50% salary increase and a position on our newly formed ethics oversight committee. It's not enough, and it doesn't undo the harm that was done, but it's a start." What about the other women who were targeted? I asked. We're reaching out to every woman named in those recordings to offer restitution and public apologies. Several have agreed to return to the company in elevated positions. Others are pursuing legal action, which we will not contest. And Brendan? Webb's face darkened. Brendan Morrison will never work in this industry again. The FBI has charged him with multiple felonies, including sexual assault, drugging, invasion of privacy, and racketeering. His trial starts in 6 months. The real satisfaction came during that trial. 27 women testified against Brendan and his network. His wife had left him before the charges were even filed, taking their 2 children and moving back to her parents' house in another state. His $800,000 suburban home was in foreclosure. His country club membership had been revoked. None of his former golf buddies would take his calls. When the prosecutor asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up in the packed courtroom and looked directly at Brendan, who was seated at the defendant's table looking like a broken man. Your Honor, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Mr. Morrison told me I would never amount to anything in this industry, that I should just smile, accept his behavior, and be grateful for whatever scraps of advancement he chose to give me. He said I was naive to think the business world operated on merit rather than personal relationships. I paused and pulled out a folded acceptance letter from my jacket pocket. I've been accepted to law school on a full academic scholarship. I'll be specializing in employment law and victims' rights. Mr. Morrison was right about one thing. This business is about relationships. But he was wrong about what kind of relationships matter. I gestured to the crowded courtroom, filled with women who'd come to support the victims. These are the relationships that matter. Women supporting other women, survivors helping survivors, people standing up for what's right instead of what's profitable. Brendan's shoulders shook and I realized he was crying. Mr. Morrison thought he was teaching me about power, I continued. Instead, he taught me something much more valuable. He taught me that predators always underestimate their victims. They see someone young, inexperienced, vulnerable, and they assume we're helpless. But we're not helpless. We're just waiting for the right moment to fight back. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket. He also taught me that justice doesn't always come from the system. Sometimes you have to create your own justice. Sometimes the best way to end a war is to let your enemy defeat themselves. The judge sentenced Brendan to 5 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $2.3 million in restitution to his victims. Thomas received 3 years for his role in the conspiracy. 6 other managers across the 4 companies received sentences ranging from probation to 18 months. As we left the courthouse, Roxanne Torres, who'd covered the entire trial, approached me. I'm writing a book about workplace harassment networks and how technology is changing the game, she said. Would you consider writing the foreword? The book, titled Recorded Evidence: How Predators' Own Words Brought Down a Harassment Network, became a bestseller. My foreword opened with the line, "The most dangerous moment for any predator is when they start believing their own lies about being untouchable." 3 years later, I graduated law school at the top of my class. Roxanne had left journalism to become my business partner, and we opened Torres & Associates, specializing in employment law and workplace harassment cases. Our first major victory involved exposing a harassment network at a tech startup, using the perpetrator's own Slack messages and recorded Zoom calls as evidence. The firm where I'd worked as a junior accountant was now held up as a model for how companies should respond to harassment scandals. Harrison Webb regularly spoke at conferences about the importance of believing victims and taking swift action against predators. The recordings Ms. Delilah provided didn't just expose criminals, he'd say in his presentations. They saved our company's soul. During my law school graduation ceremony, I received an unexpected letter forwarded by the prison system. It was from Brendan, writing from federal prison. "I hope you're satisfied," it read. "You destroyed my entire life, my marriage, my career, everything I worked for. All over a misunderstanding. You could have just talked to me like an adult instead of playing games and setting traps." I wrote him back. One sentence. "You destroyed your own life." I just pressed play. Last month marked the 5-year anniversary of the scandal. Our law firm now employs 15 attorneys and has offices in 3 cities. We've handled over 200 harassment cases with a 94% success rate. More importantly, we've seen real cultural change in how companies handle these issues. 3 of Brendan's former victims now hold senior positions at Fortune 500 companies. Patricia from payroll is now the CFO of a major nonprofit. Rebecca, the junior associate who'd been forced out, became a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime. "You gave us our voices back," Rebecca told me at a conference where we were both speakers. "Not just by exposing what happened, but by showing us that we had more power than we realized." I still keep that original recording on my phone, though I've never had to use it again. Not for legal reasons. The case is long closed. I keep it as a reminder of something important. Predators count on their victims staying silent, staying scared, staying isolated. They see someone young, inexperienced, vulnerable, and they assume we're powerless. They think they can control the narrative, manipulate the evidence, and use their positions of authority to silence anyone who threatens them. But they always forget one crucial detail. Their biggest weakness is their own arrogance. They can't resist bragging about their power, documenting their conquests, building monuments to their own cleverness. Brendan started a war he thought he'd already won. He had all the advantages: age, experience, connections, institutional support. He controlled my career, my references, my future in the industry. What he didn't control was his own mouth. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's letting your enemy destroy themselves while you document every word. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the system. Sometimes you have to record it yourself. And sometimes the most satisfying victory is when your oppressor realizes that they handed you the weapon you used to defeat them. Brendan thought he was teaching me my place in his world. Instead, he taught me to build a better world where predators like him have no place at all. I didn't start that war, but I definitely finished it.